then Brent, why don't you introduce who Hylant is and what you guys do?
Sure. I wanted to thank everyone for joining, and thanks for Afidence for having Rob and myself on the webinar today. Hylant itself is one of the largest private full-service insurance brokerages in the United States. We service local, national, and international markets. We also provide insurance like commercial insurance, employee benefits, private insurance, specialty insurance, including cyber insurance. And we have a full team dedicated to cyber coverage. I'll pass it over back to Spencer, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Brent. Agenda. So a couple things. If you wouldn't mind, please make sure you're on mute. I think I went through and got everybody, but please make sure that you're on mute. And then if you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat bar. We will have some Q&A at the end to take questions from the audience. But here's what you can expect from the presentation. We're going to really hit three things. We're going to talk about what is cyber insurance, so cyber insurance 101, the current landscape of insurance, talk about the most important controls, as well as why they should matter to you. And then we're going to talk about the future of cyber insurance, so how that's going to change in the future and why that matters to you. So that's our agenda here. And I'm going to turn it now over to Bryan, who's going to moderate or mediate our conversation here. Bryan, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much, Spencer. And just to echo both Brent and Spencer, we really appreciate you guys being here today. So really, we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about like the top controls that are important today, as well as what controls are right around the corner that organizations need to start thinking about implementing. But before we do that, I thought it would be good for us just to do a little bit of cyber insurance 101. And so just to kind of get a good baseline. So with that, I'm going to direct these questions to Rob. So Rob, thanks for being here today. So like in a nutshell, so what is cyber risk insurance? Why do companies need it? And how is it actually priced out?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Very good questions here. So let's start here with what is cyber insurance? Cyber insurance has been around probably a good 15 years, maybe a little bit longer. Started really gaining traction, getting popular 7 or 8 years ago. It's gotten to the point now where I feel like it's almost a mandatory line of coverage to have. You've got your general liability, you got your property. Cyber is really kind of getting to that point because, as we've seen time and time again, in the news, these companies that are getting hacked and having cyber events and cyber breaches and things of that nature. So the question of what is a cyber policy? How does it protect me? It's basically made up of two buckets. The first is going to be your third-party coverage. These are basically liability coverages. So if you are sued, this will cover you. So privacy liability and regulatory laws, payment card industry, they can levy their own fines and penalties. Media liability for things like libel and slander and all of that. All of that liability, if you are sued, is covered under a cyber policy. Again, if someone's information becomes compromised and it's your company's fault for it and they file a lawsuit, that is also something that comes into play. So that is your third-party coverage in a nutshell, is basically it's your liability coverage. Your first-party coverage is going to be the things that basically help out a company directly. What I mean by that is in a ransomware situation, if you have to make a payment to these bad actors that have taken over your system, that's part of your first party coverage. Business interruption, which is a huge part of a cyber policy. If you have a cyber event and your company cannot go on and you are losing revenue as a result of a cyber event, that lost revenue is covered under a cyber policy. That's your business interruption. That's also part of your first party. Things like data restoration and reputational harm, bricking, and then I know that we're going to get into this in a bit, but also social engineering, which is rapidly becoming a large part of the cyber industry. Those are all the things that are covered. And again, there's more to it, but I'm kind of going through the basics here. But that's basically what is covered under a cyber policy. So your next question, Bryan, is how is it priced?
Right.
You get this question all the time, right? It's priced in a few ways. Number one is going to be what controls you have in place. There are certain things that we're going to get into as far as certain controls that an underwriter, an insurance carrier is going to be specifically looking to make sure that you have before they will write coverage for you. That is a big part of it. In addition to that, your annual revenues, which tells the company how big you are, that's part of it, as well as your class of business. For instance, a government entity is going to be priced much differently than a manufacturing company, even if they have the same annual revenue. So class of business is also a big part of it.
Got it. That makes sense. And I know we're going to get into the controls here in a second, but you started with on the pricing standpoint of just saying, hey, what controls you have in place does affect pricing. So even beyond the industry, even beyond revenues, right? So that makes a difference. And I can think back as, we've seen the evolution of just cyber insurance applications, of just, submitting an application to obtain it. Probably, 5 years ago, you're talking about one page or a section of one page, whereas today I think our cyber renewal application was 7 or 9 pages long in and of itself, which I got to believe is reflective of those controls. So that being said, what are the more common types of claims you guys are seeing that's obviously driving the need for these controls?
Yeah. So Bryan, a quick sidebar here on what you were just saying about the application length. When I first started in cyber insurance 8 or 9 years ago, I could give you a quote with just the name of your company and your annual revenues. And if you wanted to go ahead and bind that quote and turn it into a policy, you needed to confirm that you had antivirus and a firewall. And if you said yes to both of those, I gave you a cyber policy. Those were the Wild West days of cyber insurance back then, when we could kind of do whatever we wanted, before really the rise of ransomware and all that. So things are obviously much different now. A big part of that is the rise of ransomware. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with ransomware. Just if you're not, basically your network is taken hostage and you are completely shut out of it until you pay these bad actors, which is our name for the hackers, X amount of dollars, almost always in cryptocurrency, because it's tough to trace. So that is the main issue. The number one claim that we are seeing in the cyber world is ransomware. It has been for the past 3 or 4 years. I'm not really sure if it shows many signs of slowing down in the future. But in addition to ransomware, one thing that I do want to point out that we have seen really go through the roof in the past few years is social engineering. If you are not familiar with social engineering fraud, it is basically when you are tricked into voluntarily parting with your own money. Here's what that looks like. You get an email. It looks legit. It looks like it's from a coworker that says, hey, we forgot to pay this vendor. Can you go ahead and pay this invoice? Here's all the information for it. Or it looks like it's from one of your vendors that you normally pay that says, hey, we are changing all of our banking information. From now on, please start paying us at this account number and this routing number, or something like that. It is made to look like it's legit, usually email. And it turns out that it's a bad actor out there trying to get you to do something that you ordinarily would not, or pay something that you don't owe, or something of that nature. That is social engineering fraud in a nutshell. 5-10 years ago, this stuff was extremely easy to point out. It is not that way anymore. It has become a lot more complex, a lot more sophisticated, and a lot harder to root out. Social engineering is probably the second biggest claim, type of claim that we see. If you ask me 5 years from now, what's the number one claim that you see? I might not tell you it's ransomware. I might tell you it's social engineering fraud.
That's great perspective. Great perspective. And I know, we've seen organizations affected on both sides of that, right? Of those two examples alone. So that being said, so why don't we get into like these top controls and why they're important? And we're going to start with like the controls that are really important today. And as you'll see, we've got several that we're going to have on screen. I'm not sure if we'll be able to cover all of this, because after this slide, we really want to cover the top future controls and what's just around the corner. But why don't we get started with this? So again, back to you, Rob. So why don't you start talking through this list in terms of like, what is asset and software inventory and why is it important?
Yeah. So yeah, we'll start right there. So when you fill out a cyber application, it's going to ask you a number of things of, hey, do you have this, or what's your situation here, or what do you guys do here? These are not everything, but this is some of the big items that they were looking for. When an underwriter reviews a cyber application, this is some of the main things that they're looking for. Asset and software inventory, as you see, right there. You can't protect what you don't know if it exists. Anything that's on your network, anything connected to your network, any kind of software that you're using, any of that, you should have an inventory of. That way, if you do have a cyber event, you know exactly, you can go through and start checking stuff off to make sure, hey, this isn't corrupted, or this wasn't part of it, or whatever it is. So an extremely important part there. Another one that I really want to make sure that we spend some time on, multi-factor authentication. MFA has now been around for 5 years or so. Everyone, I'm sure, already uses it. If you do online banking, when I go to my credit card website for it, if you want to place a bet on DraftKings, it'll ask you for it. I occasionally place a bet on a hockey game, and I usually have to put it in then. So it's all over the place, right? We see it all the time. For companies, you should have MFA in 3 ways. Number 1 is going to be remote access. So I work from home a few days a week. When I am logging into our network, when I am accessing critical network things, like any type of programs or something like that, MFA needs to be in place. So remote access is going to be number 1. Number 2 is going to be web-based email. Here at Hylant, we use Outlook. Okay, I can go onto a computer anywhere in the world, go to outlook.com and pull up my email that way. If you have web-based email, you should have MFA in place for that. And then number 3 is going to be privileged or administrative access. So any kind of administrative accounts that have access to, it's mainly IT related stuff. Think about servers and your network itself and backups and all of those kinds of things. There should be MFA in place for that. So again, just to go over 3 ways: remote access to your network, web-based email, and then privileged or administrative access.
And it sounds like that should be the minimum, way you're using MFA. Probably the more the merrier, right? So the more platforms you get it deployed, the better. But people don't have to think in terms of we have to deploy it to every system, every login. It's like focus on these baseline pieces first, and you're going to be in a much better place, is what it sounds like.
Absolutely.
Great.
So a few other things that I want to pull up. One is going to be employee training. There is a stat here that, if you look at every cyber event out there, every type of breach and how it starts, the number that start with human error is in the 90s. Okay. People download the wrong things, click on the wrong things, send the wrong things out places, whatever it may be. I always tell people that it doesn't matter how good your controls are, the system you have in place, or anything like that. The human error can beat all of it. So there should be employee training that you have. Whether that be videos that they're watching or things that they go through, or pretend phishing campaigns where they send emails out to employees to see if they'll click on things, something like that. But employee training absolutely needs to be a part of what you're doing for your cybersecurity. So another big thing that we see, backups, and we've seen a big increase on carriers asking about this on applications, because sometimes in a ransomware situation, a company can say, hey, we have basically everything backed up. We may lose a day or 2 worth of work, but we can get everything back and going because our backups were encrypted and off-site, and we had duplicates and things like that. So backups are vital. You want to make sure that those are in good working order. And if you have some kind of a cyber event that affects your network, they are separate from the system, so that way they also won't be affected.
Yeah, Rob, and I know, I think of like if folks have seen this in the news, right? There's been an extensive car dealership, cyber attack over the last few weeks. I think with the CDK. Yeah. And so I think of like cloud-based platforms, because so much has moved right to the cloud. Any thoughts in terms of like, so let's say an organization is using Salesforce as a CRM, and that is a mission critical system for them. And obviously that is a cloud-based SaaS solution. What guidance would you provide those organizations relative to backup? Because knowing Salesforce is backing up their own stuff, but any other precautions you would recommend?
Yeah, that's a great point. The CDK thing has really kind of turned into a nightmare in the auto industry. You've got a lot of companies that just cannot go on and do business because they are reliant upon them. So I think my best advice for something like that is if you have basically mission critical vendors that, hey, we can't go on without them, you need to have some kind of backup plan where, hey, okay, if they go down and now all of a sudden we can't use them anymore, what are we going to do? We need to have a plan in place that we can easily get going in the event that that doesn't happen, which kind of leads into the next control of having some kind of business continuity or disaster recovery plan in place. If the worst scenario happens, if you do have a cyber event, you should have a plan in place, knowing who is going to be responsible for what and what you are going to do. And that plan should be tested regularly. What we found is in a cyber event, companies that have an incident response plan or a business continuity plan or a disaster recovery plan or something of that nature generally get back up and running way faster than companies that do not, that are basically starting from scratch and saying, okay, well, what do we do now, right? You should know who is responsible for what, who is going to be contacting whom, who has authority to make purchases if needed, how you're going to get around certain things if certain things aren't working. All of that goes into your incident response planning. So it is very important to have something like that in place.
Again, great perspective, Rob. And I know, again, especially some smaller organizations that are just looking at, getting more serious around these type of controls, they can sometimes get overwhelmed with, it's like, oh my goodness, a business continuity plan sounds like a lot to put together an incident response. And the guidance we usually give them, it's like, hey, well, if good security awareness training for users, right, so that they can more identify that there could have been an attack and make sure they know who to call. Because I think, again, sometimes folks, if they may click on a link that they instantly recognize was a bad idea, instinctively, they'll just, it's easy for them just to close their computer or to close the application and just move along like nothing bad happened. So again, the guidance we give folks is at least make sure you start with educating your folks on, hey, if something looks odd, off, know who to call. Don't assume everything's going to be okay. If you just start from that point, and then obviously building out actually how do we responding to that, how do we recover from that is great. So yeah, so good perspective on planning.
The other thing I want to bring up, Brian, is we do run into, and this is going to sound like, hey, this is common sense, but I'm going to say it because we run into this problem all the time of people that have an incident response plan and they have it saved on their desktop. And therefore, when they have a cyber event and they can't access anything on their computer, they're like, oh, well, we can't get it. Please print it out and put it in a desk drawer somewhere. Again, I know that sounds like common sense, but there's a high percentage of claims that we run into where people have a, some kind of incident response plan and it's saved to their computer and they can't access it at all.
Yeah, great perspective.
The one other thing that I want to bring up here, email protections. We talked about social engineering. Email protections are a very good thing to have in place. Something that alerts you when an email is coming from outside your organization. And this can really help you avoid social engineering. Definitely something good to keep in mind there.
Makes a ton of sense. Anything else, like a few other items on here, like I know we talked a little bit earlier about like MFA on privilege account management and reduce admin privileges, but also endpoint detection and response. So yeah, any key points you want to cover there?
Yeah, so an EDR tool is basically something that is in use that monitors your endpoint. So anything connected to your network, as far as a phone, a computer, a tablet, anything like that is considered an endpoint. This kind of monitors your endpoints for malicious activity. It is something that there are certain carriers that say, hey, we need to see an EDR tool in use in order for us to write coverage. I think in the next few years, there's going to be more and more saying that. I think it is something that is very important and definitely something worth looking into if you don't currently use one.
Perfect. Thanks, Rob. So great perspective on what the key controls that are important for underwriters and really for organizations that are, focused on cybersecurity today. We want to shift now into like the future controls. And when we say future, we don't mean like they're still in beta type of tools, but like, hey, what's emerging as even more important in the future that ultimately underwriters are going to be looking at if they're in place, because it's better to get ahead of these right now versus waiting until they're required and then responding. So with that, let's talk through those top controls today. And again, similarly, we're keeping an eye on the clock to make sure that we're going to be able to cover all of these points. But Brent, would love for you to speak to the future controls, and starting with kind of transitioning right out of endpoint management into managed detection and response.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Brian. As I have conversations with carriers and underwriters, these are the things when I'm going to conferences and asking for our own selves here at Hylant, what are the things that we need to look to the next step to make sure we have good coverage for ourselves, and even being marketable too, maybe having carriers compete for our business. So these are the things that are top of mind for me as I lead our security team here at Hylant and beyond. And it's always our goal to be above baseline, so we can be kind of good examples to our customers too. It's more of a practice what you preach type thing. So with EDR, if you're not aware, endpoint detection and response, just to follow up on that, is more of a behavior-based kind of protection. So it's not signature-based on these endpoints. It's looking at behavior. Maybe a threat actor got into one of your users' machines and is trying to use PowerShell to do some administrative type tasks. The ultimate goal is that EDR is to block that and prevent that. The next step to that is a managed detection response, is that step above EDR. So maybe your EDR you manage in-house, like an antivirus suite. Managed detection response usually involves a third party, and usually like a third-party SOC or third-party administrator. It could be your MSSP or some other security provider you have. It's what carriers are liking to see. It's not a need right now, is potentially that third-party SOC or third set of eyes outside of yourself watching for security events. It gives them a little bit more peace of mind that a company 24/7 is looking after you. Beyond that, there's a lot of attacks coming even today at the identity level. So identity risk detection and response. So this is a lot where sometimes some social engineering can be at play, or even business email compromises can be at play, where a threat actor gains access to your staff's credentials. Having detections in place to see if there's a risky sign-in for like impossible device that this person's logged into, these type of detections will go a long way in protecting an event you don't really want to deal with. And then taking action beyond that. So if you get an alert, or your third-party SOC gets an alert, what actions are they taking to stop this? Are they revoking sessions? Are they revoking their MFA sessions? Are they requiring their staff to change passwords? So thinking beyond that, once you have that detection, how are you responding?
Yeah, that's great. I know recently we've been doing some cyber briefings at some leadership roundtables, and I know I think one organization was hosting several leadership roundtables and asked us to speak a bit on cybersecurity. And I think between the first session group and then like a couple of days later, a different session that we had presented to, there was a identity hack into that organization, the hosting organization, and suddenly people were getting what were legitimate emails from somebody representing that organization that sent out to folks that are in these roundtables. So this stuff is real. So obviously anything organizations can do to at least minimize the risk for the with the right risk detection measures would be great. So let's talk a little about internal MFA and admin accounts.
Yeah, so I know we touched a little bit on it. Everyone's heard MFA. MFA probably the last 3-4 years is almost being a requirement. A lot of that's a lot on public-facing applications, cloud tools, where we're seeing an almost new requirement is anything that requires privileged access. And this is not just public facing, but also internal. So say someone from my team wants to connect to our domain controller, that should prompt an MFA prompt. And from there, you also can think beyond this. There are admin tools in your environment like PowerShell, like remote desktop, or anything like that, or maybe an administrative command prompt that should likely require an MFA token to be able to even access. And this would prevent, if a threat actor were to gain access to that endpoint, of being able to move laterally within your environment and prevent those type of kind of catastrophic events that have been occurring. So beyond that, there's more identity stuff. There's passwordless authentication. I'm sure some of us has heard about passkeys. I know Google, Apple, all of them have made a big deal about it. Microsoft's getting on board. And the importance of this is also because of MFA sessions are becoming easily hijacked and taken over by threat actors. So you need some form of phish resistant MFA to give some sort of credence to our underwriters and carriers of, hey, you're not going to suffer an identity-based attack in the future. So these pass keys and FIDO keys are something to consider for your organization. Maybe at minimum, it could be, if you're using FIDO keys, it's another device you have to manage for your staff. You could maybe at least consider them for your administrative accounts or administrative access. That's a feasible approach that goes a long way.
Great. And you're seeing the growth in that area. So again, that's newer technology, right? But you're seeing more and more major platform owners using that or offering that.
Yeah, I mean, I have to replace my back deck at my house, personal story, but I went on Home Depot to price out some lumber, and what do you know? They have passkey option already for my account. So immediately I sign up because I know that it's going to protect me from future instances, and maybe like if I have a saved credit card in their environment. So, or someone adds a new address and buys stuff on my credit card. So
that's awesome. So it's great to see that getting deployed. So let's talk a little bit about data loss prevention.
Yeah, so if anyone here has heard about data loss prevention, a lot of times it's kind of it's that big tool set that's can be rather cumbersome and usually pretty hard to manage, right? To dedicate a lot of employment to. It's getting entangled with insider threat management as well. The reality is understanding and controlling and logging where data is moving within your company is becoming a key component to any situation going forward. When you do have a breach, it's going to behoove you to understand, like, okay, what happened and how did it move. Beyond that, a DLP solution, especially some next generation versions, also have kind of like key indicators and automatic tuning to see behavior that says, hey, this is suspicious compared to the user's activity in the past days. We're seeing a lot of activity from Joe sending to his personal Gmail account. It could be a marker for maybe this person's planning to leave the company, and maybe they're looking to potentially take emails and company files with them, and that can be a threat to the organization, especially if you have intellectual property or trade secrets or information that you don't really want your competitors to know. There's also the fact that maybe someone at your company is being, I guess, considered for, maybe it can be a kind of given financially some type of motivation to give trade secrets about your company to a competitor while you're still working there. That's the type of data and data transfer you would want to know, right? So this is becoming something, even as we've done our own internal cyber insurance questionnaires. This is something we're asking, hey, when are you guys planning to do something like this if you don't already? It's becoming a kind of a growing trend because data is the new oil. I'm sure multiple people have heard that. It's where is it traveling and whose hands does it end up in is most important.
Yeah, great perspective. So the last control I know we have listed here is zero trust architecture and conditional access.
Yeah, so it's more of kind of following the principles of zero trust and conditionalized. So think about if you have devices in your environment, consider only allowing those domain joined devices to access your cloud resources or enterprise resources. This is would be vital to any attacker or threat actor in another country attempting to access from a computer that's not even in your domain. They would stop them in their tracks. Um, this could be said for the same thing for mobile devices. I mean, I'm sure there's several companies that may have allow like almost like a BYOD type mobile device, um, allowing those to still be managed in some form or fashion by an MDM to access company resources, or at least having some sort of compliance will go a long way as well. Uh, and then beyond this, there's, if you haven't heard of them already, but there's a product out there called Secure Access Service Edge. So SASE solutions is typically what they're called. These, I like to think of them as, instead of the old days where people are in the office and there's these firewalls that are your endpoints are protected behind. Since COVID, there's been a lot of remote work and flexibility and hybrid approach. If you're not doing like an always on VPN, or you're using VPN for your users to access your network, this is that next generation approach to potentially getting rid of that legacy VPN. And it's putting your firewall and your endpoint protections in the cloud. So any type of cloud movement or traffic outside of your environment will get siphoned through and protected by some sort of SASE solution. This is tends to be a very large undertaking, especially considering the size of some organizations. Smaller organizations might not have as much trouble, but if you're in a smaller organization, you usually don't have the skill set to do it. So it becomes a little bit problematic. This one might be the most difficult to implement, I would say. But it should be on your radar to consider as you modernize your network architecture for your organizations going forward.
That's great. Thanks, Brent. So yeah, we would like to open it up for participant Q&A. So please, if you guys go to the chat, you can go ahead and ask questions out there. I know I'm going to actually, on behalf of an organization that we're just starting to work with today, at least to go back to the issue of backing up SaaS-based solutions, because I know, we're about to start working with an organization, and their ERP system is run in the cloud, and they're concerned, especially after seeing like the CDK attack with car dealerships, of hey, if there's an attack on that SaaS platform, they just want to start thinking about, it's like, okay, what does that look like for us relative to business continuity? So I know we're going to be exploring, one is validating what the SaaS vendor does from a backup standpoint, but we're going to be looking at, hey, well, what mechanisms are there for the client to back up their own data out of that platform? All of that said, any other guidance or advice, because again, everybody on this call is going to be using some form of SaaS-based solutions. Any other guidance or advice that you would provide relative to protecting your own data on that SaaS platform?
I think this ties back to, and it's not something really talked about a whole lot, but it's third-party risk management. They are a third party that you depend upon, and underwriters are curious about how you're assessing your third parties. So if you're not already, start assessing. Even if you get new software in your environment, start at least doing some form of security assessment. You can make a business decision whether or not you want to move forward with it. That's ultimately the business's choice, but you have to think about the risks by doing it. And a lot of these SaaS solutions are what you're saying, Bryan, shared responsibility models. I would, if they are like SOC 2 audited, I'd look for those audit reports. I'd look for that type of information. I would also ask them directly, what are your guys' plans in the event that what's your disruption? So a lot of times they'll have, maybe you can ask them things like, do you rely on any of the public clouds like AWS, GCP, or Azure? And do you have kind of those regions that are kind of automatically redundant back and forth if one region were to go out? So I guess, since you no longer manage it in-house, now you got to think about managing your vendor from that perspective and holding them accountable. So every SaaS solution is going to be different. really. And you just got to, I would start with your most critical ones and go forward from there and just get confidence as you being the customer that they're doing the right things is kind of the best that you can do. And then ultimately update your business continuity plan if something were to happen.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, Brent. Good deal. All right. So other questions, Spencer, do we have any other questions right now in the chat?
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask the question. Let's give a 10, 15 seconds for any folks that want to kind of speak up and ask the panel any questions. If not, I have one.
Cue the Jeopardy music.
Rob did such a great job. No question to be answered.
I do have a question for Rob, and that is, what happens if you don't have a cyber policy and you experience some kind of cyber event?
Well, if you don't have a cyber policy and you have, let's say, a ransomware attack, basically you're doing everything on your own. So, there's parts of that. So your forensics, that's getting someone to come in and figure out what happened, how did someone get in, what did they have access to, all of that kind of thing. There's plenty of companies out there that do that. They can help you out with something like that. So, you need to call on them and figure out who those companies are and what they do. The problem that comes in is, so now you've got forensics and then you've got notification charges. You are legally obligated to notify anyone whose information becomes compromised in a cyber event. Sounds easy enough. The difficult part is the fact that it doesn't go based on where you're located. It goes based on where your customer is located. So, for instance, here at Hylant, we've got offices in several different states. We probably have customers in 40 different states. That's 40 different sets of notification requirements that we've got to abide by, which means that we're trying to figure that out as we go and do that all alone. In addition, things like data recreation, if you're paying or trying to negotiate a ransom demand, all of those things you're now doing on your own. The big advantage of having a cyber policy is that you are going to have a breach coach assigned to you every time you have a claim. That person will walk you through every step of the way on what you need to be doing, what you need to be thinking, what's coming next, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now you don't have that breach coach, so you're basically needed to act alone in a situation like this, which, in a ransomware situation, everything is already mission critical as far as timelines go. Now all of a sudden you're spending a whole lot more time trying to find and hire people to do things for you.
Yeah. So reacting without any form of, support, especially, right? Lord willing, this is the first time you've gone through this experience, right? And the idea of doing it fundamentally on your own, and even with incredibly competent and well-meaning folks, the reality is experience goes an enormously long way, let alone just the financial, protections that having insurance would provide. So thanks, Rob. Okay, so why don't we wrap up? We've got one.
Jeff Van Fleet, sorry, he messaged me. Jeff Van Fleet has a question, and that is in the same breath, actually, of what we're talking about here. So Jeff said, if my business is new to putting in place cyber controls, how do I get started? Where should I get started?
Brent, you want to take that?
I can. I like to start and give these customers the guidance through like selecting a framework. And if you haven't went down like any of the security frameworks that we've done or so far or that you've heard of, I would start with CIS's cybersecurity framework. It tends to be more prescriptive, more specific, and there's currently on version 8. Quite frankly, you can do your own self-assessment for free in an online portal. It can be cumbersome, but at least gives you some guidance on where to start and what controls are most important to securing your organization. Hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Brent.
So there's a question here from Bill.
Yep. Yeah, question is, backups are noted as a current control. If backups are occurring from an already infected but unrealized network, how would that impact insurance coverage for remediation?
Yeah. So great question, Bill. So one of the big things they look for backups is redundant backups. You should have backups on your system. You should also have backups in the cloud or off-site that are completely separated, separate networks. That way, if one goes down, you've still got the other one that's still viable, right? Now, if something like this happens where all of your backups are become infected, how would that impact insurance coverage for remediation? It wouldn't really. Insurance would cover, data recreation as part of an insurance policy. That's still going to come into play, whether you have all of your backups intact or whether you have no backups intact. It's still going to come into play. It's still going to pay out to make sure that you can get everything recreated there. So, insurance is there for a worst case scenario. So if you have something like this where you say, hey, everything is fried, everything is encrypted, everything is gone, insurance is going to be there to try and get you made whole again.
Maybe some separate advice here. Treat your backups as like a separate island. And if you can refrain, obviously it's probably going to be on the network to be able to do the backups, but if you don't have to connect it to Active Directory, don't connect it to Active Directory. If you can have separate storage systems from your primary storage, that's advisable, just so you have some method of being able to recover in the event of this situation. A common term that's coming around is immutable. Immutable backups, meaning even your own administrators, or if a threat actor got in and gained administrator access to your backups, they aren't able to delete them. So for a certain retention period, you have these immutable backups. Those are things to consider there as well.
Rob, Jack Patton has a question for you. He said, you mentioned earlier in earlier years, losing my spot here. In earlier years, all that was required was antivirus and firewall. Now that is trending in the future towards companies required to have EDR, MDR. Are there types of companies or specific industries that this is more common for than others?
Yeah, good question. So, Jack, here's what I'll tell you on company size, right? When an underwriter is looking through applications at a potential to potentially write a policy for someone, they are going to treat a Fortune 500 company and the controls that they have in place much different than a mom and pop shop down the street, right? They're not going to expect someone that does, 5 million a year in revenue to have the same controls in place as a company that's doing, 2 billion in revenue. So those are different. So they do take that into account. It's not really so much what industry it is, because every industry, regardless of what it is, can be hit by a cyber event. And we've seen it, whether it's healthcare or education or government or manufacturing or retail or whatever it may be. They've all been hit. So we're seeing this kind of all over the place. But definitely there's a little bit more leeway for smaller companies that might not have certain controls in place than there is large companies that have a whole lot more exposure and they expect to have better cybersecurity in place.
Thanks for that, Rob. It looks like, Bryan, we are at our 10-minute warning here. I know that we had one more question that we wanted to round out here that was to Brent and to Rob. You want to share?
Yeah. So fundamentally, what we want to set the stage for as we exit today is so we've covered a lot of information. We talked about the controls. I guess ultimately you want to direct, first to Brent. So if there's one piece of advice or perspective that you want to make sure people walk away with from today, if they can only remember one thing, what would that be?
I guess I would say that if you don't have cyber insurance today, I would at least consider it from a breach response standpoint. And the peace of mind that you get, myself being a customer of cyber insurance, is I guess I can't really put a financial figure on it other than I can sleep at night and I'm better rested for the next day. So that's one perspective I would say. I would say also for the customers that already do have cyber insurance policy, consider developing relationships with at least 3 parties. One being the primary carrier of your cyber insurance policy, because they can take advantage of tools that a lot of these carriers provide access to. And those could include external scanning, attack simulations, and maybe even subsidizing a tabletop for your organization. Beyond that, the other 2 are maybe pre-selecting a legal incident response law firm that's already on the panel for your primary carrier. They will be the ones quarterbacking your claim and any breach concern you have. So they will be part of that breach counsel or breach coaching. And then also beyond that, maybe finding a digital forensics firm on your carrier's panel just to start creating that relationship before the emergency. Maybe they would also help determine if it's an emergency situation. And this can be even easier maybe once you have an MDR or maybe an MSSP that you rely on. A lot of times those providers can be DFIR firms as well. So that would be my advice at this point.
Awesome. Thanks, Brent. And then Rob, what about you? Again, if there's one thing that folks walk away with, what would that be?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to cheat here, Brian. I'm going to give you 2. I was never good at following the rule here, so I'll give you 2. One is going to be MFA. I sat in on a breach coach giving a presentation about a year ago, and the one thing that he said that always stuck with me is, if you don't have MFA currently, you are already well behind the 8 ball. So again, you should have it in 3 ways, and it's gotten to the point where it's very difficult to find cyber insurance for companies that don't have full MFA in place. Not saying it's impossible, but it's a lot more difficult. You're gonna have a lot more options, which means more competitive terms if you do have full MFA in place. So definitely, because of how many carriers are asking about it and what they want to see, I always try and really talk about MFA quite a bit. The other thing is, I completely agree wholeheartedly with what Brent said about if you don't have cyber, you need to look into it. But I also want to tell you that as important as cyber insurance is, and I think it is very important, and I've seen it save companies several times that probably would have went under if they didn't have a cyber policy. Cyber insurance is not the be-all, end-all of cybersecurity. Cyber insurance and cyber policy should be one tool in your tool belt when you look at cybersecurity as a whole. Okay, there should be one thing that you have in addition to a number of things. You can't say, hey, I've got cyber insurance, so you know what, I'm not going to worry about having good controls in place or doing employee training or making sure that we're up to date on what's going on out there. Again, it is just one tool in there. There's nothing that's foolproof. There's nothing that's 100% effective. MFA is not anything that you can think of. Nothing is going to completely eliminate your cyber threats out there. So while cyber insurance is very important, it should be one thing that you have in a whole host of things for cybersecurity.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. So we're going to be wrapping up here. Probably one last plug I would suggest relative to something important to look at as you're working through cybersecurity priorities. Check your client contracts. So especially if you're a B2B organization, a lot of times that you may have client contracts in place that mandate certain components of a cybersecurity plan. So that's a great starting point. A lot of folks think, I'm not a regulated industry, so I just need to make sure our credit card information on file is protected. Maybe that's true, but odds are you have a client contract that may actually dictate additional controls. So I think that's an important area to start with. So all of that said, I'm going to transition it back to Spencer.
Yeah, thanks guys so much for being here. We've got 2 next steps for you just as we close this out here. So the first is, hey, you're going to be just getting a survey from me sometime before the end of the week here. We'd love to just get your feedback on this panel. This is the second digital panel that we've done this year, and they've been both very well attended. And so we would just appreciate your feedback here, any wisdom you can share, any insights, as well as which leads me to the next thing is the second next step is if you guys wanted some help or wanted to have some more conversations around cyber insurance, we can help you with that. If you'd like to have a conversation about how to prepare for cyber insurance, how to accrue more coverage, how to get some of these different controls deployed or set up inside your organization, I'm going to put a link into the chat bar here. Please, please, please reach out to us. Brent, Rob, myself, Bryan, we're more than willing to sit down with you guys and take a look at those things and see what we can do. That is, in case you missed it, that is almost exactly what both of our companies do. Hylant being a broker and then us being on the consulting side of things. So I'm going to put that link here in the chat bar, guys. But thank you so much for being here. We hope that this is a valuable panel discussion for you guys. Look out for that survey. Would appreciate your feedback. And then remember too, this is recorded as well, and I'll share the slides with you guys over email. So thank you all for being here, and keep tabs on your email.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
Thanks
Rob.
so much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Bryan. Thanks, Brent.
We'll see you.
See you guys.